They called it the Hell's Half Acre of Kansas, a lonely stretch of prairie that looked so ordinary from a distance, yet held secrets so disturbing that even now, the earth itself seems reluctant to give them up. In the early 1870s, when the promise of westward expansion brought thousands of settlers across the plains, the Bender family set up their small inn and grocery along the Osage Trail near Cherryvale, Kansas. To weary travelers, it looked like salvation. A warm meal, a place to rest, the faint glow of lamplight after days on a dusty road. Yet beneath that glow, shadows lingered long and deep. The Benders were immigrants, German-speaking and reclusive. John Bender and his wife Elvira were older, weathered by years of labor and hardship, while their two children, John Jr. and the daughter known as Kate, presented themselves with a strange mix of familiarity and menace. Kate, in particular, drew attention, young, striking, and openly claiming psychic powers. She advertised herself as a spiritualist and healer, someone who could commune with the dead or reveal hidden truths through séances. In an era gripped by both superstition and the search for meaning in a rapidly changing world, such a promise was powerful. People wanted to believe, but belief is a dangerous currency, and in the Bender home, it was bought at the highest price. Travelers entered the inn, seeking food and safety. Many were never seen again. It began quietly at first disappearances that could be explained by the dangers of frontier travel. Bandits, illness, or simply the long distances where people vanished without a trace. But as more names were whispered, as more families wrote, desperate letters asking why their kin never returned from Kansas, suspicion took root. Something unnatural was happening on the prairie. The Bender cabin itself was peculiar, divided by a heavy canvas sheet. The front half served as the inn and store, with a simple table where guests were encouraged to sit, eat, and talk. Behind the sheet, however, was a space few entered willingly. Some travelers claimed they heard strange movements at night, whispers behind the fabric, or felt the unsettling gaze of the family's matriarch, whose face rarely softened into anything resembling welcome. It was said that when guests sat at the head of the table, their backs were to the sheet, an arrangement that would later reveal its grim purpose. Rumors spread of Kate's séances in which she promised answers, but instead led her clients deeper into her family's web. She spoke of spirits warning her of hidden dangers, of secrets that needed unveiling. And often, those secrets ended in silence, the final silence of a guest who never walked back out into the open air. In 1872, the land itself seemed to speak. Farmers began discovering shallow graves in the prairie soil, disturbed by animals or rain. The remains told stories no words could soften. Skulls crushed by blunt force, throats cut with precision, bodies stripped of valuables and hastily buried. It was then that the Bender name began to turn cold in the mouths of neighbors. The family that had once seemed eccentric but tolerable were now suspected of horrors that defied imagination. The chilling realization dawned slowly. The Bender's Inn was not a sanctuary, but a trap. The table was a stage, the canvas sheet a veil between safety and slaughter. As one guest bowed his head to eat, another figure would emerge from behind, weapon raised, and strike with brutal efficiency. The pit beneath the floor was for the unlucky, the cellar where bodies waited before being dragged out to the prairie's edge. And yet, what makes the story endure is not only the violence, but the way the Benders managed to exist undisturbed for so long. They were part of a community that wanted to believe in progress, in neighborly trust, in the safety of civilization carving itself into wilderness. To admit that such evil could thrive among them was unthinkable. But evil does not wait for permission. It builds quietly, brick by brick, until the silence around it becomes complicit. By the time suspicions turned into accusations, the prairie wind seemed to know more than the people themselves. The Benders had vanished, slipping away before justice could be carried out. Their empty cabin was left behind like a shell, its walls holding echoes of screams no one would ever fully hear. Today, the bloody Benders remain a mystery of American history, a family of killers whose crimes blurred the line between folklore and fact. Were they driven by greed, madness, or some darker force whispered through Kate's claimed visions? The records are fragmented, the graves scattered, the stories half buried in dust. But the silence of that Kansas prairie still feels weighted, as though beneath every blade of grass lies a memory, waiting for someone brave enough to dig. And so we begin our journey, not into myth, but into the uneasy truth of what can hide behind the ordinary. The Bender Inn was not grand, not infamous in its time. It was simply a small home on a trail, another dot on a map of expansion. Yet from that place, history carved a legend written in blood. To understand how the story of the Bloody Benders could take root in the Kansas soil, we need to step back into the mid-19th century, a time when America itself was still a restless, half-finished idea. The Civil War had only just ended in 1865, leaving scars not only on the land, but on the minds of its people. Kansas, once a contested borderland of violence during the years of Bleeding Kansas, was still struggling to redefine itself. By 1872, the frontier here was both promise and peril, a patchwork of opportunity stitched together with fear. The Osage Trail, the very artery along which the Benders chose to settle, was a major route for travelers heading west. Wagons creaked along the dirt road, pulled by tired oxen, while families clung to hopes of new land, new fortune, and a future they could call their own. But the trail was not safe. The prairie was vast, unforgiving, and law enforcement spread thin across hundreds of miles. Bandits and swindlers were known to operate here, their presence a constant reminder that progress always walked hand in hand with danger. For many, the small inns and roadside cabins became lifelines, places where one could find food, supplies, and a brief sense of safety. Kansas at this time was a land of contradictions. On one hand, it was a place of abundance. The fertile soil of the prairies promised prosperity to farmers who were willing to break their backs, tilling the ground. On the other, it was a place of isolation. Homesteads were often miles apart, neighbors rarely seen except during church services or trips into town. Communities were fragile things, built on tenuous trust and the shared hardships of frontier life. Into this fragile fabric stepped families like the Benders immigrants, whose accents, customs, and secretive ways marked them as outsiders. Immigration was reshaping America in the 19th century. Germans in particular had arrived in large numbers, bringing with them their language, foods, and traditions. While many integrated and thrived, others remained on the margins, clinging to old world ways that seemed strange to their American-born neighbors. The Benders fit this latter mold. They spoke German, were guarded about their past, and seemed unwilling to fully immerse themselves in the community. In a land where trust could mean survival, their reluctance to blend in left them vulnerable to suspicion. Yet suspicion alone does not explain the horror that unfolded. To grasp the atmosphere of Kansas in the 1870s, one must also understand the cultural climate of the era. This was the age of spiritualism, a movement that captivated Americans from cities to small towns. Séances, mediums, and psychic healers were gaining popularity, especially among those who had lost loved ones in the Civil War. The idea that one could reach across the veil of death, that spirits could speak through human voices, was both comforting and electrifying. It was in this environment that Kate Bender advertised her supposed psychic gifts, offering séances and spiritual healing to travelers. Her claims were not extraordinary for the time. In fact, many Americans dabbled in spiritualism, and newspapers often reported gatherings where tables tipped, knocks answered questions, and mediums went into trances to deliver messages from the dead. What made Kate different was the darkness beneath her words, the possibility that her predictions were not glimpses of the future, but veiled lures designed to trap those who believed too easily. The prairie itself played a role in the shaping of this story. It was a landscape both beautiful and harsh. Rolling grasses stretched endlessly, broken only by groves of trees and winding streams. The silence of the land could be comforting, but it could also feel oppressive, especially to those unaccustomed to such vast emptiness. At night, the wind carried sounds that could be mistaken for voices, and the flicker of a lantern in the distance might stir both hope and dread. In such an environment, isolation was not just physical but psychological. It was easy for fear, suspicion, and rumor to grow unchecked. Life for settlers was difficult and often short. Illness could sweep through a household with little warning. Accidents on farms or along the trail were common, and doctors were scarce. Families relied on themselves, their neighbors, and their faith to survive. It was a world where death was close, a familiar presence that shaped the culture of the time. In this way, the Bender family's gruesome acts did not stand out immediately. Disappearances were tragically common. A missing traveler could be explained by natural dangers or criminal acts elsewhere. Only when the pattern became undeniable did the community begin to see the sinister truth. Economically, Kansas was still fragile. Many settlers were poor, scraping by on subsistence farming. Others passed through on their way to more promising lands in the West. This constant movement of people created both opportunity and risk. For the Benders, it meant a steady stream of potential victims. Strangers with money, weary from travel, and unlikely to be missed quickly if they vanished. The very mobility of frontier life provided cover for their crimes. At the same time, newspapers were beginning to wield new power in shaping public perception. The spread of the printing press and the growth of regional papers meant that stories could travel far faster than before. When whispers of disappearances became louder, the press seized on them, feeding the growing sense of unease. Yet even then, the true scale of the Benders' actions remained hidden until the grisly discoveries of 1873. Religious life in Kansas also framed the way people interpreted the events. Churches were not just places of worship, but centers of community life. Preachers often warned of sin and the dangers of straying from faith. To many, the Benders' strange behavior and Kate's occult practices were signs of something unholy, a family touched by the devil. Such interpretations may sound superstitious now, but in their time, they provided a framework for making sense of what seemed otherwise inexplicable. The Benders' Inn itself was a symbol of frontier duality, half sanctuary, half snare. To passing travelers, it offered warmth and hospitality. To the family, it was a stage for cruelty, a place where the canvas curtain separated life from death. The layout of that simple home would become infamous, its details repeated in newspapers, court records, and folklore for generations. In the broader context of American history, the Bender case illustrates the tension between progress and fear. The westward movement promised prosperity but also exposed people to new risks. Lawlessness, isolation, and the blending of cultures created fertile ground for both cooperation and conflict. The Benders exploited these conditions, weaving themselves into the fabric of frontier life until the weight of their crimes tore them out. When we examine Kansas in 1872, we see not just a backdrop for horror, but a landscape that made such horror possible. The prairie's silence hid screams. The trust of weary travelers became a weapon, and the belief in spiritual power, so common in that era, blurred the line between healing and harm. This was the stage upon which the Benders acted, a stage shaped by history, culture, and the endless expanse of the frontier. Their crimes cannot be separated from this context. They were not anomalies dropped into the prairie by chance, but products of their time, their actions magnified by the unique conditions of the American frontier. And it is within this world, a world of fragile trust, restless spirits, and endless horizons, that the story of the Bloody Benders truly begins. It began as so many frontier stories began, with a traveler in need of shelter. The Osage Trail was a hard road, miles of dust and grassland with little promise of comfort. To come upon the glow of a lantern in the Bender cabin was to feel a surge of relief. The small structure seemed ordinary, a simple log home, its roof weathered, its front room arranged like a modest store. Shelves held dry goods, a table sat near the fireplace, and behind a heavy canvas sheet stretched across the room was the family's private quarters. Guests were welcomed, though never warmly. John Bender Sr. spoke little, his words gruff and heavily accented. Elvira, the matriarch, was stern, her eyes sharp, her mouth rarely breaking into anything resembling hospitality. John Jr., with his unsettling laugh, offered a thin veneer of friendliness, though most found it odd rather than comforting. It was Kate who drew the most attention, with her striking appearance and her promises of psychic powers. She spoke of visions, of healing, of spirits that whispered truths from beyond. To the curious, she was alluring. To the desperate, convincing. The setup was simple, almost too simple. A guest, weary from the trail, would be invited to sit at the head of the table, their back to the canvas curtain. A meal might be served, conversation exchanged, but in the silence behind the curtain, another figure waited, one of the benders, clutching a hammer. At the right moment, the weapon would fall, striking the guest at the base of the skull. The blow was swift, sudden, almost mechanical. The body would slump forward, sometimes with a gasp, sometimes with silence. And then the canvas curtain would twitch, parting just enough for the corpse to be dragged behind. What happened next was equally brutal. The throat was cut, ensuring the victim's silence was final. Valuables were stripped, money, jewelry, supplies all tucked away by the family. The body was then dropped into a trapdoor beneath the table, a cellar pit where it would rest until nightfall. Under cover of darkness, the remains were dragged into the field, shallow graves dug in the prairie soil. Some were buried behind the cabin, others in the orchard where trees would eventually grow, their roots winding through bones. One disappearance could be explained. Two might be misfortune. But as the months passed, names began to stack like stones in an unmarked grave. Dr. William York was among the most famous. A physician traveling the trail in search of a missing friend, York never reached his destination. He was last seen near the Bender Inn, and when word of his absence reached his brothers, one a colonel, the other a Kansas senator, the search became relentless. The disappearance of a man of standing stirred more suspicion than that of nameless migrants, and it set into motion the chain of events that would eventually unravel the Bender's dark enterprise. The community began to murmur. Farmers noticed disturbed earth in the Bender's orchard. Neighbors recalled hearing cries in the night, quickly silenced. And yet, none had proof. In the absence of evidence, suspicion alone was dangerous. To accuse a family without cause was to risk one's own reputation. So the whispers grew, quiet but persistent, like the prairie wind through tall grass. When authorities finally organized a search, they found the Bender cabin abandoned. The family had fled, leaving behind only silence and the unsettling stench of decay. It was then that the pit beneath the floor was discovered, its dirt still stained. Outside, investigators began probing the ground. What they uncovered turned rumor into nightmare. The graves yielded bodies in varying states of decay. Some had been in the ground for months, their features unrecognizable. Others were fresher, their faces still twisted in the final moments of terror. Nearly all bore the same marks, a crushed skull and a slashed throat. The pattern was unmistakable, the method chillingly consistent. The Benders had turned murder into routine, each act carried out with cold precision. The orchard, once a place of growth, became a cemetery. Trees rose above the graves, their roots winding through the remains of travelers who had believed, for one brief night, that they had found safety. The air filled with the stench of unearthed flesh, and the community recoiled in horror. People who had once passed the cabin without a second thought now looked at it as though it had been built by evil itself. Stories spread of séances where Kate lured her victims, promising glimpses of lost loved ones, only for the séance to end in silence and blood. Some believed she was the mastermind, her visions a cover for cruelty. Others pointed to Elvira, the matriarch, whose stern presence suggested a heart hardened by malice. Still others suspected John Sr., with his silence and his shadowed eyes, or John Jr., whose unsettling laugh may have masked madness. But the truth was harder to pin down. Each family member played a role, and together they became something more terrifying than a single killer. They became a system, a unit built on death. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves beyond Kansas. Newspapers across the nation reported the grisly tale, embellishing details, painting the Benders as almost mythical creatures of evil. Some claimed Kate had supernatural powers, that she hypnotized her victims before the hammer fell. Others insisted the family had made pacts with dark forces, that their crimes were not merely human, but infernal. Folklore grew around the facts, until it became difficult to separate truth from legend. What remained undeniable were the bodies, the mute testimony of those who had trusted the Benders and paid the ultimate price. Each skull told the same story, each shallow grave whispered the same warning. And yet, despite the horror uncovered, justice never came. The Benders were gone, vanished into the expanse of America, leaving behind only questions. Some said they were caught and lynched by vigilantes, their bodies buried in secret graves far from Kansas. Others claimed they escaped to Texas or the Indian Territory, blending into the chaos of frontier life. There were even whispers that Kate resurfaced, years later, still practicing as a psychic in another town, her past hidden but not erased. None of these tales were ever proven. The Benders became both history and legend, their crimes preserved in memory, but their fate lost to time. The prairie wind carried the story, retold around campfires and in courtrooms, in newspaper columns, and whispered warnings. The cabin itself was eventually dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing remained. Yet the land where it stood still bore the weight of memory, a silence heavy with the knowledge of what had transpired. Travelers passing that stretch of road spoke of unease, of shadows that lingered in the corner of the eye, of a feeling that the ground itself was reluctant to let go of its dead. The Benders' crimes were shocking not only for their brutality, but for their ordinariness. They were not outlaws roaming the countryside, not soldiers hardened by war. They were a family living together, eating together, killing together. In their small cabin on the prairie, they turned hospitality into a trap, turning the trust of strangers into the weapon that destroyed them. And as the graves were filled again, this time with the bodies reburied in more proper ground, the community was left to grapple with what had happened in their midst. The Benders were gone, but their absence was no comfort. For if such evil could thrive unnoticed, what else might be hidden behind the ordinary? When the truth finally surfaced, it did not stay contained to Labette County. The discovery of bodies buried in the Benders' orchard exploded into one of the most sensational stories of the 19th century. Word spread quickly through Kansas, then across the Midwest, and soon the tale of the bloody Benders appeared in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. Readers who had never seen the Osage Trail now spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the prairie itself had betrayed them. In the small farming communities surrounding the Bender homestead, the shock was sharper, more personal. Neighbors who had shared meals with the family, who had traded for supplies in their front room, now wrestled with the horror that they had unknowingly brushed shoulders with murderers. Many admitted that they had felt uneasy in the cabin, disturbed by the Benders' strange manners, but few had dared to voice those feelings aloud. Now, those silences felt like complicity. The graves in the orchard became a grim pilgrimage site. Farmers, townsfolk, and travelers came to see the disturbed earth, to look upon the open pits where bodies had been unearthed. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others out of grief for lost loved ones, and still others in anger, demanding justice. The sight of skulls with caved-in crowns and slit throats hardened hearts against the family who had vanished into the wilderness. The York family, prominent and respected, were among the most devastated. Colonel Alexander York, already a man of authority, pushed relentlessly for justice. His brother, Senator Alexander York, used his political influence to demand answers. Their grief was not just personal, it became symbolic. If even a man of their standing could fall victim to the Benders, then no one was safe. The York brothers gave voice to the fury of a community that felt betrayed not only by the Benders, but by the fragility of trust itself. Churches took up the matter in sermons, speaking of sin festering behind closed doors, of how even the most ordinary homes could conceal darkness. Pastors framed the story as a warning against straying from God's path, casting the Benders not merely as killers, but as embodiments of evil itself. Congregations listened with rapt attention, and the story became a parable for the dangers of greed, deceit, and spiritual corruption. Newspapers added their own layer of interpretation. Some presented the case as an indictment of frontier life, suggesting that lawlessness and isolation bred moral decay. Others sensationalized Kate Bender's role, painting her as a seductress who lured men to their doom with her talk of séances and supernatural visions. The idea of a woman wielding such deadly influence fascinated readers, and journalists leaned heavily on this angle, often stretching fact into lurid fiction. At the same time, there were voices seeking to understand the family through the lens of psychology, though the science of the mind was still in its infancy. Writers speculated about madness, about hereditary evil, about the strange chemistry of family dynamics that could turn a household into a slaughterhouse. Some asked whether the Benders were insane, or if they had acted with cold rationality. Others wondered whether poverty and hardship had driven them past moral boundaries, though the careful way they profited from their crimes suggested something darker than desperation. The search for the family became almost a national obsession. Pauses formed across Kansas and neighboring states, riding out in hopes of capturing the fugitives. Rumors abounded. The Benders had been spotted in Texas, in Missouri, in the Indian Territory. Every arrest of a suspicious traveler, every report of a strange family settling in a distant town was seized upon as a possible breakthrough. But none of these leads ever confirmed the fate of the Benders, and with each year that passed, the frustration deepened. Some in the community believed that vigilante justice had already been carried out. Whispers spread that the family had been caught, lynched in secret, their bodies buried without ceremony. Such rumors were fueled by the lack of formal justice and the fierce anger of neighbors unwilling to let the killers escape. Yet no grave was ever revealed, no confession ever surfaced, and the uncertainty gnawed at those who longed for closure. Beyond Kansas, the story became folklore. Travelers retold it along the trail, warning each other to be wary of isolated inns. Parents frightened children into obedience with tales of the Benders, reminding them that evil often wore an ordinary face. The murders entered the fabric of American dark history, carried forward as both cautionary tale and morbid curiosity. The Bender cabin itself did not survive. Stripped by scavengers and dismantled piece by piece, it became a ruin, then nothing at all. Yet the ground where it had stood retained its weight of memory. Farmers spoke of unease when working the soil, of strange sounds carried on the wind at night, of a silence that felt oppressive. The land had been stained, and though crops grew and seasons turned, the shadow of what had occurred never fully lifted. In the broader cultural imagination, the Benders came to represent the fragility of trust in a rapidly expanding nation. Though frontier was built on hospitality, on opening one's doors to strangers, sharing food and shelter. To weaponize that trust, to transform it into a snare, was a betrayal that cut deeper than the murders themselves. It made every handshake uncertain, every smile suspect. The horror was not just in the blood spilled, but in the rupture of the social fabric that bound people together in an unforgiving land. Even decades later, the bloody Benders were invoked in discussions of crime and morality. Their story appeared in dime novels, in lectures, in local histories. Each retelling shaped them anew, sometimes exaggerating their cruelty, sometimes mythologizing their escape. The lack of resolution allowed imagination to fill the gaps, ensuring that the Benders would never fully fade from memory. For the people of Kansas in 1872, however, the story was no myth. It was raw, immediate, a wound that reopened with every missing traveler, every whisper of a family vanished into the wilderness. It was a reminder that civilization was fragile, that beneath the thin veneer of community and law, darkness could still thrive. And so the community reacted with fear, with fury, with attempts to explain, but above all, with the enduring ache of uncertainty. The Benders were gone, but the unease they left behind remained a legacy of horror that the prairie itself seemed unwilling to forget. The prairie at night was never truly silent, but in 1873, as search parties swept the land near Labette County, the silence took on a menacing quality. Horses shifted uneasily, their ears twitching at sounds that might have been nothing more than wind through the grass, yet every creak of the saddle, every snapped twig carried the weight of menace. The Benders were gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow that refused to dissipate. For those who searched, the greatest fear was not what they might find, but who they might stumble upon in the darkness. The moment of horror that would define the Bender legend came not with the pursuit, but with the final search of their home. When investigators first tore through the inn, overturning furniture and tearing up floorboards, the air inside felt heavy, as if it resisted intrusion. The building itself seemed complicit, the sagging walls and creaking beams standing as silent witnesses to countless murders. The stench was faint but unmistakable, a sickly mixture of rot and damp earth, seeping up through the wooden planks. Beneath, the trapdoor, the earth was soft, unnaturally so, and when shovels struck the soil, the sound was muffled, as if the ground itself had absorbed too much. Lantern light flickered against pale shapes, and what at first seemed like stones emerged as skulls, human and fragile, the earth refusing to keep them hidden any longer. Men who had faced gunfights and frontier violence recoiled, some gagging, others stepping back into the night air for fear they would choke on the horror. The discovery of the bodies was not a single revelation, but a series of shocks, each worse than the last. The first was Dr. William York, identified by scraps of clothing and personal effects, the very man whose disappearance had driven the search to begin with. Then came others, farmers, travelers, men whose families had long suspected the worst but never had proof. Each body bore the same marks, the blunt trauma at the back of the head, the slash across the throat. The precision of it chilled investigators. This had not been chaotic violence. It had been planned, ritualized almost, repeated again and again, with terrifying consistency. Crowds gathered as word spread and lanterns lit up the orchard, casting grotesque shadows across the disturbed earth. Families clutched each other as they watched deputies dig, the sound of shovels punctuated by gasps when another corpse was unearthed. Mothers wept openly. Men cursed the Benders' names, swearing vengeance. Some shouted into the night, as though the family might hear them from wherever they had fled. The climax of that night was not merely the sight of bodies, but the realization of scale. What had first seemed like a murder or two unfolded into the revelation of a killing ground. The Bender Inn was no simple crime scene, it was a factory of death, an enterprise sustained by trust betrayed and hospitality weaponized. The numbers grew, the graves spread, and with each discovery, the horror deepened. There was no longer any doubt. The family had murdered systematically, without hesitation, across months, perhaps years. Yet the greatest tension came from absence. The killers themselves had vanished, their chairs empty, their beds cold, their belongings hastily abandoned. The Benders were not corpses in shallow graves. They were still out there. This void, the absence of justice, the lack of closure was what haunted people most. Fear spread like a fever, carried in whispers from homestead to homestead. Every strange traveler was suspect. Every unfamiliar wagon on the horizon sent shivers through those who watched from their windows. The climax was not one single moment, but a crescendo of dread that swept across the land. Posses formed, armed with rifles and driven by vengeance, riding through forests and rivers, checking every farmhouse and settlement. Tension rose to the breaking point. At one stop, a family of German immigrants was nearly lynched after being mistaken for the fugitives. Panic blurred into paranoia, and paranoia into violence. The land itself seemed to conspire against the search. Endless stretches of prairie, tangled woods, and the shifting lines of frontier communities created a labyrinth in which fugitives could vanish without a trace. Each failed lead, each day without capture, stretched nerves tauter, until men muttered that perhaps the Benders had never been human at all, but demons wearing flesh, spirits that had melted back into the wilderness they came from. In town meetings and church gatherings, the air was thick with fear. Mothers forbade their children from wandering too far. Farmers who once welcomed strangers now turned them away at gunpoint. The entire region became a community under siege, haunted not by the presence of killers, but by their absence. The tension reached its peak when unconfirmed reports trickled in. Sightings in Texas, hangings in vigilante camps, a body burned beyond recognition. Each rumor ignited fresh hope, then collapsed into bitter disappointment. The not knowing was unbearable, the suspense more cruel than truth itself. Some claimed they saw Kate in dreams, her voice whispering promises of more deaths to come, her eyes gleaming with an unholy fire. Others swore they heard cries in the orchard long after the graves were filled, as though the victims themselves were demanding retribution. In the end, the climax was not a confrontation with the Benders themselves, but with the realization that they had slipped beyond the grasp of law and justice. What the community faced instead was the permanence of the horror they had left behind. The open graves, the ruined home, the orchard that would never again feel ordinary. The prairie, vast and empty, seemed to hold its breath. Families prayed by candlelight. Deputies rode further and further afield, returning empty-handed, their silence more damning than words. And across the land, the story spread, turning from fact into legend, a nightmare told by firelight. The bloody Benders were never caught, and in that fact lay the most dreadful truth of all. The killers might still be out there, blending into the tide of settlers, vanishing into the folds of history, watching from the shadows. The climax of their story was not their capture, but the endless echo of their escape. A wound that could never be sutured, a terror that refused to die. The homestead was gone by the end of that summer. Curious crowds had stripped it bare, each taking splinters of wood, scraps of fabric, or rusted nails as souvenirs of horror. What once stood as a roadside inn was reduced to little more than a scar on the land, the orchard beside it marked by uneven mounds where bodies had been exhumed. Yet the absence of the building did not erase what had been done there. If anything, it amplified it. People spoke of the ground as if it were poisoned, as though the soil itself had absorbed the malice of the family who once lived upon it. Years passed, but the story never left. The bloody Benders lingered in whispered conversations, in campfire, retellings in the sermons of traveling preachers who used their tale as proof of sin's reach. Theirs was not simply a crime, it was a reminder that darkness could grow in the most ordinary places. The inn had been a home, a shelter for travelers, a place of bread and warmth. That such a place could conceal brutality unsettled the very idea of hospitality on the frontier. No grave was ever found for the family. No court ever put them on trial. And so they slipped, like smoke, into the fog of history. Some insisted they had been hunted down by vigilantes, their bodies buried in shallow graves in some forgotten wood. Others swore they had fled south, reinventing themselves under false names, living out long lives as if the orchard had never soaked in blood. Still others whispered that the Benders had not been entirely human, that something unnatural had moved in their eyes, something beyond greed or cruelty, and that such creatures could never be truly destroyed. The uncertainty became part of the story's power. The Benders haunted not only the hills of Kansas, but the imagination of a nation. They became a warning about the fragility of trust, the thin line between civilization and savagery. For travelers setting out on the open road, their tale lingered, like a shadow, a reminder to think twice before stopping at a stranger's door. Historians would later try to anchor the narrative in facts. They traced court records, combed newspaper archives, compared conflicting accounts. Some details crystallized: the orchard graves, the families of victims, the desperate manhunt, but other parts blurred, twisted by retellings, exaggerated into legend. In dime novels, Kate Bender became larger-than-life, a temptress with supernatural gifts, luring men with promises of séances before delivering them to the blade. In local lore, the family became phantoms, cursed to wander the prairie, forever searching for travelers to ensnare. Even in attempts at rational explanation, the mystery endured. Was it greed that drove them? Poverty? A family pact bound by secrecy? Or was it something more primal, a taste for power, for domination, for blood itself? Psychology was still a fledgling field, but later scholars would speculate about shared delusions, about dynamics of control within tightly bound families, about violence born of isolation. Yet none of these theories ever felt large enough to contain the enormity of what the Benders had done. The people of Labette County did not need theories. For them, the memory of unearthed graves was explanation enough. They remembered the cries of widows who recognized scraps of their husbands' coats, the horror of children learning that fathers who had gone west in search of land or fortune had instead ended in shallow pits. They remembered the orchard at night, the way lantern light cast long shadows across the trees, turning them into silent sentinels over the dead. Time moved forward, but the unease never fully lifted. Even today, the Bender's tale resurfaces whenever discussions turn to the strange and the cruel in American history. It has become one of those stories that will not die, precisely because it never found an ending. A trial would have given closure. A lynching, brutal as it would have been, might have offered a final punctuation. But the family's disappearance left only ellipses, a story without resolution. And in that absence, imagination runs wild. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Bloody Benders. Not the bodies in the ground, but the void they left behind. A1. Void that still demands attention, that still makes people shudder when they hear their name. A void that teaches us that history is not always clean, that some chapters resist being tied up neatly. The orchard may be gone, the prairie may have healed, but the question remains like a splinter under the skin. What became of the Benders? The Kansas hills have seen generations since then, but on certain nights when the fog rolls low and the wind is still, locals say you can feel it, that hush, that sense of waiting. As though the land itself remembers, as though the voices of the lost are still calling from beneath the earth, demanding justice that never came. The story closes not with answers, but with silence. And perhaps that silence is more terrifying than any truth we could ever discover.